This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, and welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Renee Williams, and I'm here with my co-host, Lhotka. Today in studio, we have Ellen Crocker. Ellen works in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Good. So today we're going to be talking about fungi. So before we get started talking about that, so tell us what you do at UK.
So here at UK, I work both with the Forestry Extension Group and also with the Forest Health Research and Education Center. Most of what I do is talk about forest health, and today we're going to be talking about fungi. And some fungi can cause diseases in trees. At the same time, that's not all fungi do. They do many positive things, and in part of my work, I also lead extension workshops about fungi, both what they are and what they're doing, but also mushroom cultivation and how people can learn more about that.
So how did you get interested in fungi?
Well, a lot of what I do in forest health is understanding the things that have the ability to hurt trees. And fungi definitely fall into that group. There are all sorts of different fungi that cause disease in plants. They could be anything from little leaf spots that maybe don't do a lot but look really bad to something that can kill the tree and everything in between. On the other hand, fungi benefit trees both indirectly and directly and are a really important part of forest ecosystems. So my background is as a plant pathologist. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and where my expertise on fungi is. At the same time, I would consider myself an evangelical mycophile. So someone who loves fungi but also wants to tell people about them. And I love talking about fungi. I love sharing that interest in fungi because I feel like a lot of us kind of grew up with an aversion to fungi, either because we didn't like eating mushrooms as kids or because we were told, oh no, mushrooms are poisonous, don't touch that.
That's what I was always told, yes.
So I love learning more about them myself and helping others who are interested in them as well.
So before we get started talking about the kind of the science behind it, tell us a little bit about the grammar. There's fungus, fungi, and tell us the difference and when you use them and how you pronounce them and what.
We don't want to get it wrong.
So I am going to start this by saying I am comfortable with everyone's pronunciations. If you are talking about Latin pronunciations of anything, there is no one right way to say that according to me. You might find some other people who feel differently. When it comes to fungi is the plural and fungus is the singular. So, and otherwise, I'm just going to let it roll with pronunciation because don't ask me the right way to say something. There's many different right ways as far as I'm concerned.
All right, well, so I'm going to tell our listeners a little bit about something that you brought into the studio today. It's in a bag. It looks like toilet paper with mushrooms growing out of the top of it, which is really cool. And if you go to our website, you can see a picture of this. We're going to post this so people can figure out what this picture is. But tell us a little bit about what you brought in here.
So I'm going to hold this up, and so you might hear some crinkling of this bag. So I've got some mushrooms that I was growing on a toilet paper roll. So this particular mushroom is called an oyster mushroom, not because it's any relation to oysters, but it kind of smells like them. And these are delicious gourmet edible mushrooms. And like many mushrooms, it's breaking down plant material. And in this case, that plant material happens to be toilet paper, which obviously is made of plants. This is a fun little project that I did with a great STEM nonprofit group, Nerd Squad. Shout out to Nerd Squad if anybody knows them. I was a guest at their STEM club at Booker T. Washington Elementary School, and we inoculated these toilet paper rolls. So we put fungus in them and let that fungus grow. And then after a few weeks, with a little bit of help, mushrooms started growing out. So these are edible, and I'll probably cook them up for dinner tonight.
Awesome.
And how long did it take to get to look like that?
To look like that, I'd say about 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
That's not bad.
Yeah.
And they're kind of a whitish brown looking mushroom. Can you kind of describe it a little bit?
Yeah, so these are, I'm going to pull one off right here. And they have gills on the underside of the cap. So on the top you've got this kind of gray brownish cap. If you smell it, it smells kind of like fresh mushrooms, as you'd expect. And then the gills, which are these lines on the underside, they go down the stem. So they're called decurrent. And there are wild oyster mushrooms around here that have been popping up like crazy. I think our combination of kind of warm, wet weather that we've had these past few weeks. Yeah,
a lot of rain.
So our native oyster mushrooms have been liking that a lot. This is actually a special for cultivation strain that I purchased that works with things like toilet paper. It would also work fine in logs, other types of material, straw. You'd never grow them on toilet paper if that's kind of what you wanted to do, but it's a fun project and something that's great to do with kids.
It doesn't matter what kind of toilet paper. I mean, does it have to be an expensive brand, or can it be cheap? Or...
I haven't done that experiment, Renee. I can't tell you.
All right, so now we're going to be digging into our main topic, and tell us, what are fungi?
So fungi are a really diverse group of organisms. Everything from the yeast that you use to make beer or bread, to mushrooms, to the molds that grow on your old food in the fridge. So fungi cover a lot of ground, and it's really hard to kind of pin down what they are. But they're an entire kingdom that's separate on its own, different from animals and different from plants. A lot of people, I think that fungi are, grouped with plants, but they're their own thing. They do have, some similarities to plants, some similarities to animals, but they're on their own little group. Like animals, fungi don't make their own food. So plants, they photosynthesize, they get sunlight and they turn it into energy. Fungi don't do that. They need to get it by eating organic substances. Unlike animals that ingest food, fungi absorb dissolved food. So they secrete digestive enzymes into the environment, into whatever they're eating. So in this case, it might be a toilet paper roll, but more realistically, kind of out in the woods, when you see fungi, what you're seeing is kind of a mushroom. Maybe the fungus is eating a log, digesting that woody material and feeding off of that. Some can be seen with your eye, like these mushrooms, but most fungi are going to be microscopic, so really small and you would never see them. They have cell walls. Those cell walls are made of chitin, which that name might sound familiar. It's what's in insects and crustaceans.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they're a really interesting group. They're super abundant and diverse. There's so many different types of fungi, and they are all over the place.
Okay. So what are fungi doing in the environment then?
So the number one role when I think of fungi in a forest or something like that would be nature's recyclers.
Okay.
They are breaking down plant material. They are making it accessible in other forms. So whether it's leaves or logs or roots or what have you, they're breaking down organic material. Sometimes that could be living mutualistically, so living closely with another organism, benefiting it in a partnership. So while most fungi might be breaking down dead material, sometimes they can be living with a tree and benefiting the tree, and the tree's benefiting them. So you have mycorrhizal fungi that live in and on the roots of plants. The plants photosynthesize, they get sugars, they provide those to the fungus that then will give them nutrients, better access to nutrients like nitrogen in the soil, phosphorus. Similarly, you've got fungi in other mutualistic roles, like lichens. Have you all heard of lichens or seen them before? So they are actually a mutualism of a fungus living with an algae. So the algae is photosynthesizing, the fungus is kind of providing the home for that algae.
Okay.
Yeah, so they can be beneficial. At the same time, I mentioned I'm a plant pathologist, so fungi can certainly be pathogens. Especially of plants, they're a huge group of pathogens. They can cause major damage. They can cause minor issues. For any gardeners out there, I know you've dealt with fungi before.
Explain a little bit about pathogens.
Pathogens cause disease. Okay. So in this case, what we're talking about is anything that's causing a problem in that plant or difference from normal. Sometimes I think the hard part is knowing when is that pathogen actually a problem for the plant and when is it just a kind of minor issue that really isn't going to affect anything. So one fungus that I can think of would be tar spot of maple. I imagine if you've looked in the fall, you might have seen some maple leaves that had these big black dots on them that were kind of raised. It's a fungus called tar spot. And there have been many studies on tar spot that have found that actually it doesn't hurt the tree at all, because by that point the tree's already losing its leaves. It's not really negatively affecting its ability to photosynthesize. At the same time, it looks like it might be really bad. So that's really different from maybe a fungus that's eating the roots and preventing the tree's ability to thrive in the same way. You might never notice it, but it can have a bigger impact. At the same time, I'm talking about plant pathogens. I think it's worth mentioning that some fungi can actually be human pathogens or pathogens of animals. So dandruff and ringworm and kind of some of those things that you might not think of fungus, histoplasmosis, as well as some other issues, aspergillosis in individuals who are immune compromised. So fungi play this really diverse range of roles. And do a lot of different things, but I think when we think of them, we should think of them as recyclers.
Okay, so sometimes it's essential to help the plants then?
Oh, definitely.
By the way it sounded?
Yeah,
So some could be really, really good for the plants.
Oh, very, very beneficial, yeah.
Okay, so tell us, what is a mushroom?
So I think most of the time when people think about mushrooms, it's synonymous with fungus. So people don't really think about the bigger fungus that's doing all of the eating and living and digesting, the vegetative part of that fungus. They see the mushrooms, and so that's what you think about. But really, mushrooms are just the fruiting body of that fungus. Most of the time, what the fungus is doing, you might not notice because it might be underground, it might be in a tree, it might be in a log, and that's going to be where it's eating. It's breaking down that organic material, and that's going to be in a form called hyphae. And those are long, kind of thread-like filaments that are doing that. When you see mushrooms, what that means is that the fungus is reproducing. So it's making spores, which are like the seeds of that fungus, to get to new areas to make new fungus colonies. So I'm holding up one of those mushrooms that I brought in with me. So Renee and Laura, you can check this out. But
we'll take a picture of this so people can see it.
Oh, great. On the underside, you've got lots of gills. And any mushroom you buy from the grocery store is going to be the same. The whole purpose of these gills are just the way that this particular mushroom is getting its spores out there. So if we were to look at this really close under the microscope, what we might see are little spores on the end that would be dispersed by wind to some new location. So the mushroom is really just the fruiting body of that fungus. It's going to come and go, but all the time there's going to be this bigger fungus, this vegetative structure that you don't see.
And can you tell us what types of mushrooms there are? I mean, what different species?
Lots and lots of different types. And they all kind of do their own thing. So we talked about this one that has gills, these oyster mushrooms. Some of them don't have gills at all. They have pores, but still the same thing. They're getting spores out there in their way. So that might be some things like polypores or conchs. You might see puffballs. Have you seen puffballs before?
Yeah, is that the one that shoot out?
They can shoot spores right out the top.
I guess that's why they're named that.
Puffball, yeah.
Puffball.
And so when they're younger, they just look like big balls.
Yeah.
And if you were to cut it open, it might be totally white on the inside. And you'd be like, what is this thing? But as they age, the inside becomes kind of filled with those spores, and they can shoot out the top in little puffs, which is really cool. There's just a huge diversity of different ways that fungi that produce mushrooms get their spores out there. And again, that's just a small sliver of fungi are the ones that we see that make mushrooms. So while we might like them a lot, we might care about them and find them very interesting, I think it's worth remembering that those microscopic fungi are still really important. We just don't see them and notice them as much.
Okay, so how do you grow mushrooms other than on toilet paper?
Yeah, well, toilet paper is probably not the best way to grow them, but fungi are kind of like us in that different fungi are going to have different preferences. Some of them are going to like growing on very kind of particular things. They might just want a freshly cut oak log. Others might eat just about anything, like these oyster mushrooms. You could grow them on all sorts of things and they'd be perfectly happy. So it really depends on what you're growing and what you have to feed it. So if you think of all of the mushrooms that you get in the grocery store, all of your portobellas and white button mushrooms and cremones, they're actually all the exact same species of fungus. They just grow them slightly differently. And all of those are grown in a large commercial indoor operation on composted manure. And they probably aren't things that you'd grow yourself at home. So a little different there. But then if you think about things that people can grow in woodlands, maybe even in their backyard, here in Kentucky we're mostly talking about shiitake. So shiitake mushrooms, you might have tried them. They do sell them in the grocery store, but they're one of the kind of most popular things to grow here in woodlands. They can be easily grown outside on logs. They like oak, but they can also grow on other species of freshly cut logs. They can also grow indoors on big kind of operations in the same way you might grow some other mushrooms on compressed sawdust logs. But it's a kind of nice thing to do for yourself, your family, to grow a few shiitake logs and see what happens.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. For those of you who may be just joining us, each week towards the beginning of the show, we will play a wildlife sound from the forest. So here's our sound for today. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we will tell you what this animal is and why it makes this sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. And what's the process for that? What are some of the things that you would need to grow those?
Yeah. So I'd say the first thing you need is to find some good logs. And that can sometimes be the most limiting step for people because you want logs that are not too big so you can actually deal with them. So maybe 4 to 6 inches in diameter and not too long so you can pick them up and move them around. So a few feet long. You want them to be in good condition, so freshly cut with the bark and everything intact from a healthy tree. And then what you would do is you would drill holes into that log and you would put some fungal hyphae right in there. So you can buy that as spawn or plugs that have been inoculated, so they've been kind of thoroughly filled up with that fungus. And so then you'd kind of close up those holes just to keep it from drying out before the fungus is able to start digesting that log. And you want to store them in a nice kind of shady, moist area so they don't dry out or get too heated because the fungus wouldn't like that. And then give it some time. The fungus will digest that log, will eat what's there, and after, it depends on kind of the environment it's growing in, but maybe 6 months, a year later, you might start to get some mushrooms fruiting out of there. And then depending on how you grow them, you might get mushrooms occasionally. You might be able to shock them with some water and get them to produce mushrooms more frequently, but it's a fun thing to experiment with. So.
And is there a season for them that they would grow? I mean, if you were cultivating them yourself, would they come out in the spring or summer
There
or
are
fall?
lots of different strains of shiitake.
Oh, okay.
So it's something that you can kind of play around with. If you naturally let them produce mushrooms when they feel like it, they might be more likely to do that sometimes of year, versus if you're kind of keeping them on a regular schedule by shocking them in water, you can get them to produce more frequently. They're not going to produce when it's really cold outside, but even in the winter, you'll get shiitake productions.
Okay. And so what about just kind of finding mushrooms in the forest?
Oh, so we're talking about wild foraging. Yeah. So there are lots and lots and lots of amazing different native mushrooms that we have that you might find on a hike. I find it really fun to just go out and see what I can find and try to identify it all without thinking too much about whether or not I can eat it. And I think that's a really fun challenge, but I have discovered that is not what most people want to do. Most people want to know if they can eat it or not. And I think that that's tough because there's no kind of silver bullet way to determine whether a mushroom is safe to eat or not. You can't really trust any of the folklore about, if an animal eats it, it's safe to eat, because that's not true. And what you really need to do is to look at every mushroom on a case-by-case basis to determine what species it is, to make sure you can distinguish it from any potentially poisonous edibles or other fungi that you might confuse it with. So you really want to be 100% certain that it is what you think it is and that it is a safe mushroom to eat. So deadly poisonous mushrooms can look very similar to edible mushrooms, particularly at certain points in its life cycle, and it's important to be 100% certain before eating anything that you know what it is. Several of the most deadly poisonous mushrooms, like the destroying angel or the death cap, they're in a group called the amanitas. They contain amatoxins that cause rapid liver failure. So
how much would you have to eat?
Oh, even a little bit.
Just a bite?
A few bites. And you might have to get a liver transplant.
Oh my!
They're very serious. At the same time, that's only a few mushrooms are going to be deadly poisonous, but a few is enough that you really want to be careful. Many of them can cause you to be extremely sick and regret having eaten them, and that's also terrible. So my recommendation is, instead of finding something and then trying to figure out if you can eat it, anyone new to mushroom foraging first learns to reliably identify some easy gourmet edible mushrooms like morels or chanterelles, chicken of the woods, lion's mane, and how to distinguish those from any poisonous lookalikes. So identifying to species isn't something you can do right away, and that's okay. It takes some time, and that's why I kind of recommend people just learn to like learning more about mushrooms and identifying them, and then in that process you'll get better at it. But something I would say is that even once you kind of get familiar with some mushrooms and you think you know them, every time you want to go out, you want to make sure that you're reviewing the characteristics of that mushroom and any potential poisonous lookalikes, because it's easy for them to be growing together and you could accidentally kind of mix things up. So something to do each time. If you're trying something new, start small, because some people can have weird reactions to certain mushrooms, different allergies. And if you're taking medications, keep in mind that some mushrooms can react poorly with different medications. Fungi are valued for their medicinal properties as well as just being delicious. So it kind of makes sense that you would want to think about that. One really kind of clear example, which maybe isn't a medication per se, but alcohol can react with certain mushrooms. So even if you ate, let's say, an inky cap mushroom, or it's called Tippler's Bane, even if you eat it and then drink alcohol several days later, you can get sick from that.
Wow. Oh my.
So something to consider, once you go down this road, is that you might not know if you have an allergy to something, but also you should probably check the medications you're taking. other tips that I would have for anybody interested in foraging or picking their own edible mushrooms would be to make sure you're storing mushrooms properly, because even if you picked something that was edible, if it gets moldy and contaminated with bacteria, I mean, it's growing in the soil, so it's pretty easy for that to happen if it's stored in kind of an airtight container and it's not refrigerated. That can cause it to become make you sick, even if it would have been perfectly edible to begin with.
Mm-hmm. So how do you store them? What's the proper way?
Well, I think one of the things is you don't want to let them sit around for too long,
Okay.
but you want to keep them cool, so definitely refrigerate them. Don't put them in like a plastic bag or something where they're not going to get any airflow. Like a paper bag would be preferable for that. And then when in doubt, throw it out. So if you don't know what it is, or you think it might be past its prime, just throw it out. And then you don't have to worry about it, and it's not worth potentially getting sick over that. So, and for anybody who's listening, if you think you might have eaten a poisonous mushroom, the first thing you should do is seek medical attention immediately, because, you might have a Facebook group where people know a lot about mushrooms, but they are not medical professionals. I am not a medical professional, and that's, a big difference. So you should take that seriously.
And tell us a little bit about, if you are out in the woods, where can you go to find these, whose lands can you be on and that kind of stuff?
Oh, yeah. So if this is something you're interested in, there's lots of places you can learn more about it. I'd say definitely get a good resource book and start to educate yourself. Maybe pair up with a local mycological society or go to some forays and get some experience hunting with some people who know their stuff and can help guide you. Don't do it on your own. It's much easier if you've got some expert opinions. There are some good online groups. I would take everything from there with a grain of salt, because sometimes people comment even if they've got no idea what they're talking about, but sometimes it's really useful information. So that's some information about kind of where to go for more resources. But if you're thinking about where to go to actually do some foraging, you got to follow the laws when you're doing that, of course. So Kentucky state parks do not allow that, but national forests and parks do allow mushroom foraging for personal consumption, and they've got regulations listed that you can read about. They have some other rules, like how should you carry the mushrooms when you're collecting, so that the spores that are in there have every opportunity to disperse and make new fungi and new mushrooms in the future. In addition, there's private land that you can forage on if you've got permission. So your land or that of someone who's given you permission to do so.
Okay, thanks.
So now I've got some questions for you all.
Okay.
Oh dear.
So I brought some mushroom trivia with me.
Okay.
So my first question for you is, how big do you think the largest fungus is?
How big, like in inches is what we're talking about, maybe?
Well, I don't know.
Or tall? Are you talking wide or tall? Either one?
I think how wide?
How wide? Some of them I've seen have been pretty big. Just pictures that you have taken, I don't know. I would say, I'm going to guess a foot.
How about you, Laura? Any guesses?
I am not sure. I have no idea.
So the biggest fungus that's out there is way bigger than that, because what you're thinking of is the biggest mushroom.
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm thinking mushroom. You're right.
So the terminology there is tricky, because the biggest fungus that's out there is huge. So I am sure some of you listeners out there, and maybe you all, have seen the U-Haul trucks with a sign for the humongous fungus.
So actually, I have seen that.
So the biggest fungus out there is maybe around 2,000 acres.
Wow. Not even close.
Huge, and it's thought to be over 2,000 years old, in addition to just being massive.
Wow.
But it's really, I will say, despite loving those U-Hauls and the great advertisement for fungi in general that they provide, I think it's a little hard to know if this is actually a single organism or if it's a lot of different fungi connected or not connected, but maybe are the same fungus that are out there, because what it is it's going to be that vegetative below ground form of the fungus. So it's not like you're going to see a huge mushroom. And if anybody has actually gone to go see the humongous fungus, they might be a little disappointed because the mushrooms on it are just going to be a few inches across. They're not going to be any bigger than normal. They are a type of honey mushroom, which we do have growing around here. But that particular colony of it is huge, is massive. So very big vegetative fungus all underground feeding on the roots of nearby trees. The mushrooms themselves don't scale up, unfortunately.
And where is that?
I think that one's in Oregon.
Oh, okay.
I think so. So another question for you all. We talked about the biggest fungus. How about the most expensive fungus?
I know some mushrooms can get pretty expensive depending on what kind of you're looking for.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
But I don't.
I just know what's in the grocery store.
$3.99. I know some of them I have seen have been like some I've seen has been like $60 to $70 just for an ounce.
So
which I was like, wow, I just can't afford that.
I know, right? That's a pretty big sticker value on
Yes.
that. Yeah. So probably the most valuable mushrooms that we have growing around here would be the morels. And so, yeah, you might find those for anywhere from $30 to $90 a pound when they come out in the spring. You can even go to the Mountain Mushroom Festival in Irving, Kentucky and buy them yourself from some mushroom foragers, and I highly recommend it if any of you haven't been. But it only goes way up from there. So that's kind of what you might see locally. Have you tried truffles or truffle salt or truffle
I haven't
oil?
tried them. I've heard of them. I forgot about the truffles, yes.
Yeah. So when it comes to the gourmet edible fungi, truffles are going to be pretty high up on the list.
Yeah.
So a white truffle, a European kind of special species of truffle, would go for several $1,000s.
Oh my
a pound.
goodness.
Yes. So these grow mycorrhizally with different trees. So that same kind of mutualistic partnership that we were talking about, where the fungus grows with the roots of the tree. And it's a really hard thing to get right because you've got to have the conditions right for the fungus, the conditions right for the tree. You got to make sure it's that fungus and not another fungus that's growing with the tree. And even then, let's say you get everything right, it can take many years for the fungi to produce these truffles, and they're all underground. So then you've got to find them. So there's some good reasons why truffles are so pricey, plus the fact that they are just, amazing from the perspective of flavor and smell and those kinds of things.
So obviously they don't taste like the ones you get in the $3.99 container.
A little goes a long way with them. So a lot of the truffle oil and salt that you get in the grocery store actually is not with real truffles. It's kind of an artificial truffle, either flavor or scent. But even with the real ones, a little will go a long way and can be used sparingly. More sparingly than your white button mushrooms. Okay, but that isn't even the most expensive fungus at all. So we've just been talking about gourmet edibles, but some fungi have medicinal properties and are really valued in a lot of traditional medicines for those. And even research more recently has shown that they have some big benefits to people. So what I could find out there, and this might not be the most expensive fungus in the world, but one of the most expensive ones I could find just by looking around is a parasitic cordyceps fungus that infects and kills caterpillars, which sounds kind of weird. And if you look it up online, the pictures are kind of terrifying. It's like a weird zombie mushroom fruiting from the head of this caterpillar. But they are highly valued for their medicinal properties and can go for several $1,000s an ounce. So these are really, really pricey fungi. So they, very expensive.
Yeah, definitely.
And we do have mushrooms or fungi in that group, cordyceps, here that are native to this area. And what they do, it's very interesting, is that when the spores land on one of the hosts, so let's say a insect of some kind, it will kind of turn it into a zombie and change its behavior and take it over.
Yeah,
And then mushrooms, it will kill it, and then mushrooms will fruit out of it. So it's kind of like something from a sci-fi.
Yeah, that is
book.
weird.
Yeah. So that's a little bit of trivia. Let's see. How many species of fungi do you think there are?
Oh, goodness. No, you're not just talking about mushrooms. She got me on that, the first one.
Question. I almost tricked you, but not quite. How about fungi in general? The microscopic as well as the macroscopic, the mushroom-producing ones.
I'm guessing thousands.
Yeah, that's what I would think.
Well, I asked you a doubly trick question because while there are about 70,000 species of fungi that have been described, it's probably just like the tiniest fraction of what's actually out there.
Oh my.
Because new genetic work has shown that actually there's a lot of fungi that we never knew were there. If you're sequencing all of the DNA in, say, soil or something, it's like, wow, there's a lot more fungi than we ever knew about. So new estimates suggest there's likely more like 5 million different fungal species out there, and we only have, the tip of the iceberg as far as what fungi are there. So a lot of different fungi. Yeah. So I think that's all the trivia I have for you.
Okay. So wrapping things up, a lot of great information on fungi. What do you want to leave our listeners with? What's a takeaway message for them?
Let's see. Well, I think it's important to remember, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed with mushrooms and fungi and think that you have to be an expert to do anything with them. And while I think some of that is true, you do want to be 100% certain before you eat anything that you aren't familiar with. I don't think you have to be an expert to just enjoy fungi, to appreciate what they're doing in the environment, to take some beautiful photos of them on your hike and identify what species you're seeing and maybe learn more about what they're doing in the environment. And you can reliably grow your own mushrooms in your backyard or on your property. So I think that even if you're not an expert, there's a lot of different ways that you can be kind of a mycophile and loving fungi in your life. So that's kind of what I'd like to remind people of.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you, Ellen, for joining us today. We greatly appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So if you'd like more information on what you've heard on today's segment, just visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. So stay tuned now for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. So here's our sound for today.
All right, so what was that sound?
So that sound is actually Mallard Hen, and the traditional quack we usually hear associated with ducks. The one thing that you need, that most people don't really realize is that that's really just the hen, that makes that noise. The male duck, which we think of when we think of mallard ducks with that nice green head and their beautiful plumage, they don't make that sound. They make this sound. So it's a very different noise than what we traditionally think of as a duck. They do make a bunch of other sounds associated with a couple different activities, but really the males are less vocal than the females.
Okay. And so now the females have the brownish looking...
Yep, that's right. And there's a reason for that. I was going to say
coat, and I'm like, that's not right. Feathers.
Plumage.
Plumage, there you go.
Yes, so when you think about what their strategy to survive and reproduce is, the males are trying to show off to attract the mate, whereas the females, for about 25 days, will have to sit on top of some eggs in
She's
the middle of a
blending in.
field trying to incubate without getting eaten by various things.
Right.
So yeah, their strategy really is to blend in and be dull, whereas the males are showing off. You know, so that's, you know, they do molt a couple times a year and change those feathers out. And about this time is when those plumage feathers for the males are going to be at their best, because this is actually when they are trying to find their mates for this year. And they're not like geese that have a mate that they hold for majority of their life. Every year they try to find a new mate, and sometimes multiple mates during that year.
Okay. I know when we used to live at a different house, there would always be a pair that would come, and evidently it must have been a different pair, but he always came to our yard every year. And so were they not the same? I thought they were, but...
So the hens actually will nest in the same spot every year, especially if they have success.
Okay.
It's one of the things that researchers for waterfowl actually take advantage of, where they have the nest... they'll actually put out like nest boxes or whatever for ducks. Mallards, they put these little tubes out in the middle of a wetland, and they can put a monitoring device on that duck, and then the next year they can go back and get it from the duck.
Oh, okay.
Because they'll actually, as long as they survive, will usually come back to the same pond.
Oh, okay.
So it's probably the same hen. It may not be the same male.
Okay.
So yeah, they are pretty good about returning to the same place as long as they're alive, and they can live a long time.
Okay.
Mallards, the oldest mallard confirmed in the wild was 27.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so they are capable of living a long time. Now, most of them don't live that long. Most of them only live about 3 to 5 years in the wild.
Okay.
They major sources of mortality include hunting. But a lot of times they get picked off by predators, especially during breeding season in the spring and summer. They have to, the hens especially get picked off at that point in time.
So how many eggs do they typically have?
Oh, so mallards will lay about 10-ish eggs. It kind of depends a little bit on the health of the hen and a few other things, but that's a pretty good estimate on the average for them. I couldn't tell you the exact number, but that's right about that. They do some interesting things in terms of when they're raising their ducklings. They will adopt ducklings, right? So after they hatch, the duckling, it'll follow them around. Safety in numbers kind of idea.
Right.
There was a thing going around social media where there's one duck that had 72 ducklings.
Oh my! I missed that.
Yeah, it was a specific type. It was a merganser that up north had just basically adopted all these ducklings. They're all following her. So that's an extreme case. So usually, especially in park settings where you have a lot of hens around in one spot. That doesn't usually, it's not how it works
typically
in the more natural prairie where they do a lot of their breeding.
Right.
So
so the nest, do they always put it on the ground? They don't put it in trees or anything
so
high up?
Mallards are ground nesters predominantly. I mentioned the tube in the middle.
Right.
So that's man-made structure that is filled with actual hay and things that simulate grasses, which is what I actually will nest. Okay. They're not like ducks like mergansers and wood ducks that'll actually nest in tree cavities. They're a ground nesting duck, which most of our dabbling ducks, which is what mallards are, they will feed by tipping up their butt and feeding in mud and things like that. Most of them are actually ground nesters.
Okay.
And they use grasslands closely associated with ponds and rivers.
Okay. And how long do the offspring stay with the parents?
So usually they'll stick around with mom through first migration, flying around. They get their flight feathers and they start bopping around, and that's when they start they can make their own decisions. They become mobile to that extent. But during usually up till when they start migrating in the spring or fall. I'm sorry, not the spring.
Fall.
They migrate back upwards in the spring north. So
when do they typically come back here?
So we usually will see an influx of waterfowl in starting, depending on weather, November. When it starts getting cold up north, they'll start getting pushed down. We do have a lot of species of ducks, including mallards, that will breed here. Especially those park mallards. But when we talk about like the actual overall population of mallards, which is about 10 million birds, they're up north, and then they come down and they'll do a lot of wintering in the south. And the reason I picked them for Sounds of the Forest is they're actually depend very heavily on the bottomland hardwood forests that we have in the south. So especially prevalent out in western Kentucky that flood now, and it provides them all the food that they need to survive and shelter they need to survive the winter. So that's kind of one of the things that they depend upon. So they come down here, they'll spend November, December, January, and February they'll start going back north.
So now I guess they are their feathers help with the weather and protects them from the weather.
The down, So you hear about goose down and
pillows and all of that.
Absolutely, they get very, very thick. Yeah, they are able to withstand very cold areas for periods of time. Like anything else, they still need to eat, which really drives a lot of what their movements are and getting pushed down. So they'll as long as they can get access to food and have safety, they'll stick as far north as possible because it pays to not have to fly as far. Flying is dangerous.
Right.
So. Okay.
And I know there's an expression, I'm trying to remember it too. It's like water off a duck's back or something like that. Do you know why that it was?
Yeah. So ducks will preen themselves, and when they're preening themselves, they actually are moving oil onto their feathers from their body, which helps them shed water. So water off the duck's back, right? So it sheds the water, helps keep them dry so they're able to fly efficiently. Oh, okay. So yeah, they're actually, yes, there's a scientific backing to that saying. Unlike some, but yes, that one does.
How far are they able to fly?
Well, they can fly a couple hundred miles in a night.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Do they get very high?
They can get very high, thousands and thousands of feet. Yeah.
Oh, and doesn't affect them?
Nope.
No? All right. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, a lot of our bird species, especially the birds that migrate, will migrate over thousands of feet, which is why it's a concern for airplanes.
Right. Exactly.
So, so they're... I'm trying to think if there's any other really interesting facts, but the mallard duck is actually, between them and the muscovy ducks, are the father of all of our domestic waterfowl for ducks. Yeah. Okay. They all trace back to those two. Even though we have many, many species of ducks, the muscovy and the mallard are actually our parents of our domestic ducks. That's probably my last duck fact for that.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for coming in. We appreciate it.
Sure. Glad to be here.
All right, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky. If you have any questions about things that you heard on today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. This spring, we have a new show schedule. We're going to be on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon on WRFL 88.1 FM.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM, and of course via radio at 88.1 FM in the central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.